Okay.
And
So,
we are live.
right.
Great.
So
So
I know that some of you were able to make the previous main session, and some of you were obviously involved in the planning sessions and the workshop before that. I thought a useful place to start for this would be to just run through, from the perspective of anyone who was on one of the teams, what actually happened in the incident testing session. So from my point of view on the blue team, obviously we started off going down completely the wrong track because we were looking at a denial of service attack. There was no steer to look otherwise that came to us until later on, after the first, let's call it, move, uh, at which point we refocused. There was then a very good response, which was probably premature, to revoke all root access. But of course, that left us unable to access it. And then we turned into more of a technical advisory function, sharing that information out across the other teams before the wrap up. So at that point, we kind of knocked ourselves out of the game by saying we're revoking the access. Okay, we've done that. Great. It slowed down the red team, who we don't have here, so we're not quite going to get their perspective. But it slowed them down. But what do we do now? So just from the management and customer team sides, what did you two see?
So from a management perspective, I mean, basically, we, with any of these scenarios, it's you kind of got to frame it. We worked out what our escalation was. We worked out, what we should be doing. So our communication with you was to say, let's, what do you want? We got a message. Do you want us to lock the root certificates? What I guess we didn't get was a message that said, do you want to lock the root certificate, revoke the root certificates? Brackets, we won't be able to get in anymore. But I feel that from a point of view of managing the flow, everyone was quite coordinated about getting that together, and we ended up with a program of response. So there are, as you say, with any of these things, there's a few twists and turns, but at the end of it, I felt we'd actually responded in a quite a structured way. So, and again, that's from my perspective, but it'd be good to get the feedback for anyone who was sitting in on the management stream as to what was going on. The other thing that became apparent was, with the customer side, was really needed to kind of tie that together, focus on the big customers. So in my experience, you normally end up with that 2 groups rather than 3 groups. You end up with management and customers doing the external comms, and then someone shielding, if you like, the tech resource to get on with the real work while you're kind of managing expectations externally.
From the customers group, so the incident we had, it was first reported to us by one of the customers, and they weren't really cooperative at the very first, and they were even angry. We had a lot of angry customers, some of the major customers as well, in the first stages. But then, because of the structured way we dealt with it and proactive approach, they were quite happy with us in the end. Not too happy, but we didn't lose them because we were open and transparent to them. They still trusted us to be capable in handling this.
Not happy with the incident, but happy with the response.
Yes.
Am I the only one here that was on the red team?
You are. Can you give us the red team perspective?
Yeah, you guys had a bunch of things that you actually had to do rigidly and dealing with multiple facets, so that we didn't really have so much rigidity to what we needed to do. We just had to figure out how to do something that was going to work. So in a lot of ways, that's very similar to, actual fact. Bad guys aren't going to have, things that they have to comply to, things that they have to, go along with. There's going to be certain things that basically, it's what you can or what you can't do when it comes to that sort of thing. So I do think that that's kind of an interesting angle that we got to look at, because we had, in a sense, and even, you can see it with the article I sent actually on the delivery group about how the CIA had been hacked and their tools had been discovered. And, you know, the blue team, right? The ones that are supposed to be defending are always going to be in the security field. They're always going to be at a disadvantage. They always have things that they have rigidity to, that they actually have to go by this. They have to comply to these specific rules. They have to like be satisfying the customers. They have to deal with the legal stuff because they are in fact a part of a larger system. But the red team is always going to have the opportunity to not be a part of that system and figure out what they can and what they can't do. So it was rather, you know, in those terms, somewhat realistic.
Okay.
What was interesting in the exercise was the asymmetry of information. I mean, you know, obviously, you know, as you say, you got that rigidity, but I'd say I'm not sure how often a red team has complete observability of what that culture is, unless they've been an insider or they've got some other insight. So, but the asymmetry of information, you know, we were getting a few bits of information through. I think that's quite realistic. When I've been involved in these incidents before, you only get a very partial view of reality, and it's trying to make sure you keeping everyone's perspective on the same is very important.
So I guess, yeah.
I mean, the asymmetry of information was deliberately built in, so I'm not sure if you'll have seen the other team's briefs. But for example, we had customer brief, which hopefully I'm screen sharing successfully. Yeah. And obviously they had a particular motivation, which was very selfish, as you'd expect from the customer. It's look after your own customers. Blue team was, you've got KPIs to meet. That was the big motivation. That's what they're incentivized to do. And that was a deliberate choice, so that first DDoS attack, you could meet the KPI on that. And I think that's part of the reason that the blue team went a bit wide after it turned out not to be the DDoS, because then you can't hit that motivation, and that was what was originally driving them. So I think that showed something. Management bonuses are linked to customer satisfaction. I'm hoping that got across to the management team, and that's what they were trying to do, to get customer satisfaction out of it, and by keeping the customers, they got it. And of course, red team, well, ransom is your main revenue stream, so that was what you were looking to do, however you could manage it. So the motivations there were deliberate. I'd be interested to know whether they did come across and whether they did make a difference to the way that the different teams worked.
Can you rephrase that question?
Did the motivation for the red team, did the motivation of you want to make money come across and affect the way that you did things? If we'd said instead,
definitely,
you want to get to this particular file, I'm assuming things would have been very different. But
yeah, most definitely. And it also kind of set up for why we set things up at the end the way we did too, because basically we want to be able to continue going and infecting more people with ransomware. We don't want anyone to think that it was anything like what we're doing. We want to be unknown, show up, boom, we locked your system, that's it. So keeping that as a main revenue stream was very important in the decisions that we made.
You guys also seem to have some fun. You're trying to frame our own employees.
Yeah, anything for a distraction and to keep you from realizing what was about to happen, and so that we could be able to continue pivoting and escalating our privileges. Also, hopefully, maybe someone could get fired or something, and we could be able to watch the media, have a little fun with it too.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like there was what was good about this exercise, James, was the amount of information, because sometimes you end up with this really heavy brief and people overinterpret it. I think it was a good balance of enough information to be able to react, and then a bit of ad hoc and fitting it to what we knew to fill in the gaps.
Okay. And for management, you did actually merge with the customer team at one point. I don't know if that went out for the rest of it. Did that come from this? I mean, would you have done that if instead your motivation had been more, let's say, if it had been part of a group company and your motivation had been to protect the parent company instead?
Well, I mean, I think that's just maybe based on the experience I've always had, which is you break it into two teams, internal and external. You have more than the three-way chat, and you lose your shit. It's best to just have it in, you know, external facing and internal facing, and then you can free up the resources and let the internal teams run and make sure they've got enough resource, because you never know how long these things are actually going to carry on for. So yeah, that was a tactical thing we did. So again, I don't know if anyone else has experience of these sort of exercises in reality, but once you get more than one set of communication out and one set of communication internally, it really starts to break down. You end up with loads of cross wires.
That reminds me, at the beginning of the exercise, we had only 3 people in the blue team. And they were really, really under-resourced to deal with anything. So we have made some other resources available for them. Anyone who could help them, we try to move them to their group.
Yeah.
Did that help you, James?
It did help them. I will admit I was quite cruel to the blue team by being as unhelpful as I could possibly be. So it was on them. It was very much what expertise they had. I helped them with some information, but approach and everything else was all on them. And of course, if you've not been in that sort of scenario or gone through that sort of exercise, it's going to come as a shock. But that was deliberate again for it was an under-resourced team, and management did start putting people in, but quite late in the day.
I was going to say it'd be good to get a read back from anyone else who participated in the exercise, maybe from a lower base of experience than we've all got. What did other people? Is there anyone on the call today who kind of went through the exercise, and what did they think?
Adam, were you on one of the teams?
No.
In that case, Wallaby's the only one who was on one of the other teams, and he's now our voice of red team. So
yeah, exactly.
Can't trust anything the red team says.
So what were the lessons learned for ACMA?
Well, I'd say that's something for management to address.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the ubiquity of these exercises. That the problem is, it's best to try this out when it's not serious and to run through it. And it's very much an attitudinal piece, which is how people tie into it. So in my experience, it's always good to have these scenarios and run people through. As long as you get full participation, you got to treat it seriously.
That is correct. And it's lessons learned in a good way, that the way you handle your response is so critical to retain your customers.
Yeah, and sorry.
I was going to say, I think that the lesson learned from my side is it has to become kind of somewhat of a cultural thing as well. I think that it should, I mean, this might be a little bit, I don't know, I forgot what the word for it was at the moment actually, but not every one of us is the same kind of nerd, but I do think that game idea and, bringing it to a level of something similar, if we could, to D&D, but for people, in security, and being able to bring it out there and get, everyone involved. Like literally security should be a cultural thing. So having a kind of game that makes it, that brings it closer to people, and, if you could develop something that would nearly have like the same kind of cult following almost as like D&D or one of those games, but within within the field that we have to work with initially. I mean, that would be a major move for normalizing this kind of thought process.
There are a handful out there. They're very light on detail at the moment, but they do exist, mainly from or developed from threat modeling games. But one thing that I have found, because I've been involved in these sorts of scenarios before, usually they're more like a scripted escape room. You don't have a team on the other side. And the other thing that's always been, without exception, that I've come across, is that they're management focused. It's you have the management team in there doing the incident response. You might have some of the operations team, but you certainly don't have much broader than that across the company in there working through the exercise. So on the blue team, we had some very technically competent people, but again, they just hadn't been through that sort of scenario. They hadn't dealt with a response and incident in that way. And that does happen genuinely in SOCs on not an uncommon basis, because even with SOC engineers, SOC analysts, security analysts, they're often not trained up to do that response. They're trained to spot an anomaly and follow the playbook through, which is great. But how do you deal when it's not covered by what you've got in-house?
And I guess the other thing is that we are a fairly self-selected audience. Anyone who spends their time, the inordinate amount of time we spent on the Open Security Summit doing through these exercises is quite narrow sort of nerd, to be honest. Whereas if you go to the more general company, you're going to get a much wider range of experience and understanding in terms of what's going on. So I think one of the critical things for me, the management team were able to grasp what was going on and communicate it internally. I think one of the really interesting things here as a skill for the technology community, the security community, is how you put these, when you communicate up the seriousness or the response types, how that's done, the language you use when you talk to the business, because there is quite a lot of cover your ass that goes on in these situations where people want to find someone to blame, especially in large companies. And James, you've got more experience with this than I have, but there you see a certain set of behaviors, and it's great to kind of try and flush that out in the game a bit.
We have some very senior people with us today as participants. What do you guys think about your experiences with incident scenarios or real incidents? Go
on, pick on someone, Didar.
Nick. Who's the first person?
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Am I senior? Can I quote you on that?
I've read your book. I think I'll go with senior, or at least experienced.
I'll take that then. Yeah, I mean, relatively, this it's really good to see this much interest, because sort of, I mean, I shouldn't say this because the session's being recorded, but like the dirty secret of these kind of games is you still have to sell them as an idea to customers. They either don't see the value, or it's really difficult getting all the senior people together, or it will make people, and as was highlighted, management tend to do these games, it can make them look really bad. It's from a...
It can show how bad they are, you mean?
Well, or just unrehearsed. But I mean, pick whatever analogy you like the military going into battle, but you've only ever practiced on the shooting range. No one's ever shot back. Or imagine I don't know what the standard of soccer was over the last few days, but people who haven't really practiced in close proximity for an age. But imagine a sports team who only ever practice kicking the ball around, and suddenly you're on the field of play and there's another team trying to tackle you. What on earth do you do? That it would be ridiculous to train a sports team that way. But yet our senior managers are like, you'll be fine, manage your usual KPIs. Then suddenly a breach happens and they could just stumble around, but also they don't take the opportunities these kind of games provide to practice and fail and mess up and get things wrong. So when it really happens and it's the genuine newspapers on your front doorstep asking what you're going to do about this breach. That you've done it 20 times in a game before, and you can express yourself really eloquently. It's something you've done so often. Instead, they kind of hide away and hope you don't get breached, which, as we all know, in security only works for so long until the inevitable happens in some way.
See, that's why I think that it would be good if it was like a cult following game. Like we start something that we actually really enjoy doing, and just develop it and keep playing it. When people get to a certain like place where they're going to actually talk with a manager, bring them into the game, have them actually experience something that interacts with different groups in different places, where they're actually having some sort of attack happening, where people are, that's kind of the team that they've chosen, that they've been progressing through, that kind of thing. Like,
so it's a juice shot for scenarios, basically.
Oh wow, that's sorry, excuse me. So I'm just very conscious of. I think that's a really great idea, but I think Ben's like you're aiming to be the absolute I don't know, what's it, flagship product. But certainly, I mean, I don't want to dull anyone's enthusiasm. That's certainly worth aiming for, but be pleased with a little less to begin with. But then again, why not?
I understand.
Yeah.
But also, yeah, if people spend a couple of hours just sat around a table playing through a scenario, other people join in, other people see they seem to be having much more fun in their meeting than everyone else is having, then yeah, a product or an offering or an open offering could certainly get somewhere and make a difference, which is the point of all this, isn't it?
I think the first thing is DMing back and forth, actually figuring out the different areas that would work out, making sure that, and I don't mean DM like direct message, I mean like, like the dungeon master scenario, actually, kind of work out scenarios and like go back and forth with them, so that we can have kind of a, like an actual development, something that we're progressing and learning. It's something that helps us, and then we can also bring in others as a part of that game. Basically, if we do something like open source it, to the extent that it's able to be.
Well, one of the things I think would have been great, and unfortunately Tony wasn't available, but was to have an kind of a removed moderator, and I think that is a very important role, because what we were basically, I think the group that are doing it are fairly experienced, so we're able to kind of share that moderation group between us. But I think to have to actually give people, as you were saying, Nick, that responsibility they can't hide, they've actually got to run with it. And then they're exposing themselves to a kind of review of what's going on. To have that moderator take that helicopter view and say what is reasonable and not. What I've seen happen quite often when I've been involved in these scenarios is you get a very distorted perspective. Someone who's doing the game has got a particular interest or a particular bugbear about lawyers, and those things come out. There's always a natural misconceptions, but I think having a moderator on top of it, and the only other thing I was going to say that when I said juice shop, I didn't mean a fully automated piece. I thought what was quite useful was, and you made the point, James, just having a deck of Monopoly cards that introduces some element of randomness and some element of pre-prepared scenario, and recording this in a way that can be reused, I think is probably quite practical.
I mean, I'll be honest, I think it needs to be tied together with threat modeling so that you can tailor your deck to the company that you're working with. So you've got that element of randomness, but you're going to have different threats, and therefore you will have different scenarios and different approaches.
On that, sorry, excuse me, interrupting while you
no, interrupt away. This is a general, everyone can talk.
I mean, this is kind of what the summit's all about, isn't it? Sorry, as soon as I interrupted, I'll remember what I was going to say. Is for that there's two options, and this is where, I mean, as per my experience of running war games and people who've the experience of people who've run war games in general for the military for decades, is get very close to your stakeholders and see what they want and see what you can achieve. So either you're absolutely, so the answer is, as per all the consultants, is it depends. Either you want a deck of cards really closely tailored to the customer that reflects what those teams go through, reflects the relationships, reflects the bureaucratic hurdles and so on, or that will just get everybody playing the game to bring up their old grievances and their old grudges, and basically it will be an expensive argument and you will never work for that company again and you won't make a difference. Or if you're within that company, it's even worse, because then you've caused a massive argument and then you've got to turn up for work the next day. So the other option is that you have a completely fictitious scenario. It's a company in a completely different area, but still the same rough idea of SOC and threat hunting team and customer facing team and management and so on. But you make it divorced enough from everybody's real world situation that they can experiment with the concepts and the different ways of working, the different technical solutions, without it bringing up old grudges or current political discussions within the company about who should run what and so on. And that's part of what you, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, this is why I was saying it should be something that we play and that there are teams in different places, because that makes it something that you're not bringing up old grievances. You're working against these other teams, and the teams can switch, depending on, on the game at the set time, I guess. But that way, yeah, you're working, you have someone that's not connected that's running the scenarios. You have someone that's going to be disinterested from the specific situations in your given location. You're not using the real information because you are doing it with other teams. And it's something that
I think some sector relevance is good, but maybe not the exact same company. So, what would be useful would be if you say I'm in a sector, oil and gas or media and entertainment, whatever it is, and if you took some real breaches and made your playbooks out of those, then that would be a great way of doing it, because then you're kind of, it's not you as a company, but you've made it something that's quite close to reality. And I think when we were organizing this, we tried to think of something that was fairly realistic. And that's where, what I find with war games, and obviously I've only been involved in a few, is that if you lose the perception of reality, then you disengage.
I think there were a couple of things that came up when we were discussing it, because one thing was whether or not we let people self-select the teams or just randomly assign them. And I do think the random assignment of people, as opposed to saying which team do you want to be in, probably got away a bit from that to I'm invested in this particular role. So if, for example, someone's got a particular perception of lawyers, it's less likely to come up about that, because they could easily end up in a role where they are the lawyer, or or alternatively where they've got no contact with legal. So it moves someone away from their traditional role and forces them to think a bit around it. I don't know if that's necessarily how it actually works, but that was the thought process behind random assignation.
With this, again, I'll say, excuse my Teflon shoulders, but it depends. It's a case of what's games and war games are a really generic tool. There's massive issues around, well, not issues, let's call it debates over what you do and don't call a game, do and don't call a war game. Whether you want to call it tabletop exercise if you want to get people involved and interested, call it training if you want to get training budget, that kind of idea. So be very conscious of what you want to achieve through a game. Like in this, you sort of, the casting, as it's called, of who you allocate to which role doesn't really matter, because you just want to get people interested and into it, and no one's worried about what their boss might think in this. When you actually run this for someone internally or for a third party, you want to think, well, what point do the stakeholders, what point do the people paying the bills want to make? Do you want that person who doesn't understand why lawyers are all such arses to be a lawyer and give them a nice brief sheet like you did? The quality of the introduction you gave was really good. A nice printed sheet that says, this is a professional exercise, we're taking it seriously, not here's something I've scribbled or something I've cut and pasted into Slack. Just that little bit of extra effort. In the same way, if you did that with someone who doesn't understand why the legal team are always getting in their way, just explain to them, these are the aims of the legal team. You must not expose your organization to liability at any cost for any reason. Your job and reputation within your entire industry depends, blah, blah, blah. Suddenly that person who doesn't like lawyers has to role play a lawyer, and they've got an entirely new perspective on that role. You can really make an impact, but you always have to make sure, is that the impact you want? What kind of arguments may or may not that generate? And also, as I say, sort of the main stakeholder, if it's internal, who's organizing the meeting, if it's external, who's paying for the third party to come in, what's their main aim? And regardless of what they say with the first time you ask them 3 or 4 times, what do you really want from this? Is what to do with this sort of tool. You might but I mean, that's shown. I mean, that's from the amount of discussion it generated, and from having watched some of the recording, just you can get so much out of it, and it's a game, so it's fun. So people get much more involved than they do through a PowerPoint slide deck or similar.
And I've had quite a lot of experience on this on business continuity, and the parallel I was just thinking of, we've had a lot of discussion about risk through this conference, and about how you quantify risk and put it alongside other financial risks or other, insurance risks in a business, and how you need to have that quantification. This scenario felt very much like the ones I've been through on business continuity. So what I'm wondering is if, and I know that, for example, the BBC do that on a quarterly basis. You do this quite a formal stand-up. You have a management team. You have people supervising. You run through different scenarios. You have a degree of randomness. It just feels to me like this would sit alongside one of those continuity exercises, and this ties back to what Phil Huggins was saying about, you have hygiene issues you just need to deal with. You have risks you need to analyze, and then you have resilience. He doesn't like the idea of a risk register. So I'm just wondering whether partly scoping this to sit alongside a continuity exercise is also quite an important thing.
I'd say, excuse me jumping in again, but just, yeah, definitely. And again, and as Wallaby said, like the kind of nerds we are, if this isn't a game, it's just a scenario planning exercise that comes under existing business continuity, that's a great way to get people to participate. It's a great way to get buy-in. Also, it's a great way to get budget. Also, there's a blurry line between security and safety. Like surviving a criminal hacking attack is a resilient thing to do. So it should fit in within the same terms. You can justify it in the same way, and also it can make the same difference. You can see issues you might have in your organization that otherwise only come to light when they're actually happening, and everybody's running around and half your organization is down and so on.
And I'm just thinking about ways to force this to happen, but I've seen insurance policies that state you've got to have a business continuity drill every quarter. So, maybe that this drives a need that says we didn't just have a plan, we actually tested the plan. I think that's something that could drive this behavior to say, look, and here's a way, back to James, think about running this as a service. This is something that it means when you go back to your cyber insurer, you say, not only do we have a proper incident response plan, we have security teams, we actually test it on a quarterly basis. That may well have an impact when your underwriter looks at your cyber insurance policy.
I was thinking also it would be interesting if each time a scenario was run, basically each time a scenario was run and the team was satisfied with, I don't know how that would work. I'll come back with it once I get that sorted out more.
Lessons learned. I mean, I think if what you're publishing here is a set of playbooks that people can run through and use, but you've also got the conclusions at the end, you can do a kind of like almost a comparison as to how your exercise played out compared with another outcome. I think that's quite useful.
I was thinking about systemic hardening, I guess. So over time, as people continue doing this this type of exercise and bring it back and try again, thinking about what they've done before and the kind of exercise might end up becoming important. So they've implemented these things. Those things are going to be now in place as far as their setup, but then gradually, the problem with that kind of thing, though, and I think it's cool in some respects, and I don't in others, but I think the problem with that is that eventually their rule set would become too real, and people would be able to play the game and know kind of how someone developed their security type thing or whatever.
But then again, if you've got to the point where your rule set is absolutely realistic and prevents anyone from ever winning the game against you, you've pretty much won. If you're implementing that in real life as well, it shouldn't matter that everyone knows how your security works, unless they could beat you in the game.
Yeah, that's
okay. So continual hardening then would be something to introduce to it. But this becomes less of a card game and more of like a video game type thing, not video game, but like a.
I'm seeing, I'm seeing, as Nick's mentioned, and I think you mentioned as well, it's tabletop, fairly freeform role playing, or LARP if you want to throw costumes into it. The orcs are at the door type of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, all of this complexity adds to the reason that it appeals to nerds like us.
Yeah, and the problem is then getting it to appeal to people who can drive it through a company as well.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean,
appeal to what they want, which is, I mean, Ben made a great point about insurance premiums, or your underwriters are saying, well, we can see how good you are. We've seen how you responded to this scenario 2 years ago and how you responded to a similar scenario 3 months ago. We can't charge you as much because you're less of a risk, because your organization is obviously a lot better at all of the gray nebulous stuff around incident response, all the things like the communication and having the playbooks ready and operational tempo, rather than, well, we've bought another DLP service, or we've bought more firewalls, or we've got more third parties on retainer. That if you could use replayed similar scenarios within a general gaming framework to not only demonstrate to your underwriters that your organizations become better, but also to your management and to your staff themselves. I mean, I realize we're sort of a little bit preaching to the converted, but if you play video games, if you level up in role-playing games, or if you just get better at games that you play against the same people over and over, there's something about just becoming better at that thing you've practiced and being able to measure it. And that's what this kind of exercise can do. Rather than you find out whether you're better or worse when you get breached, you find out if you're better or worse because of that exercise that takes place once a quarter. And staff put in that extra effort because they see the difference it makes, and they know they'll get a chance to use those skills within the next 3 months.
So I'm working the media supply chain, and I think this is a future stage maybe for how you quantify how people are performing in the supply chain. So there's an assurance that says you've done, you've actually applied the controls and you've got the necessary checks in place. But then I think that human element of training, I think having run through a scenario like this would be very useful.
I'm just thinking of all of the times where I've seen contracts or customer requests saying, do you do your BCP test once a year, once a quarter? And it's just looking for a tick in the box instead of, yes, we do, and here's what we learned from it.
Yeah, did you win?
Yeah.
Or if you lost, do you know why you lost?
I think if you lost and you know why you lost is actually, that's a more important one, because if you just always win, there's lots of ways to do that. That's really easy by doing a bad exercise on the other side.
Here's the thing to think about, though. If you had unlimited money, your security could be tighter, and you could figure out ways of, of actually doing things, you know, with like you have more money. But if you want to limit the resources in the game, that's going to be something that's going to be more useful, I think, is because that way it's more realistic. But at the same time, you have to think about it. There are going to be different organizations that are going to come in that are going to have more money in actuality. So it has to be realistic for them too. So how do you kind of balance those things? You know, people have to be able to have a chance to be doing well for where they're at with the resources that they have, without it being, you know, an organization with extreme amounts of resources. So that's something else to consider.
Dinis was talking something about that, like you get 10 points each team and you only can spend them on a number of things because each item is 2-3 points. Well, you will have to choose and prioritize.
I like multiple modes of gameplay for this aspect, because you can play it where you have to be good with what you have, but like just a set amount. But then you can also play it the other way, where there are differing amounts of resources based on what the needs are of your organization and what you would be able to actually do. So you have the two different modes. You can go into and use the one mode for particular types of exercises and the other for a different type of exercise.
It's also useful. I mean, that's a good point, because it's also useful to use this to plan out where you will spend your resources. So as in, well, we'll spend twice as much on firewalls, but if you then play through an exercise with that, with much better, say, firewall technology, and still you don't have the staff to admin them or respond to all the change controls, or you've still not got a great relationship with your vendor, you can run this exercise in an afternoon and save yourself sort of a couple £100,000 in contracts.
So almost doing wargaming as part of the RFP or part of the tender.
Yeah, it's just seeing
the roadmap.
Yeah, seeing how this would work is a great way to play it out. Plus, I mean, I'd have made a great point bringing up that whole idea about resource allocation, because it's really easy to think, well, why don't we just get this, this, and this? When you put especially non-security team players in the position of where you can have this incident response contract or these resilient firewalls or this staff training, but we simply do not have the budget for all three or the administrative staff to manage the introduction of all three. So pick one. When you put other people in your shoes, when you put them in the decision trees that you're having to navigate through, then this you can really make an impact with this kind of game. And also then those kind of teams will say, well, I appreciate you don't understand our position. This is the kind of choices we have, and can use a gaming framework to express that as well.
So we had 5 rounds. Did we 5 rounds of 20 minutes? And I think if you look at that, the step-in costs of doing this, especially if, as you say, those briefs are pre-written, and it doesn't need to be that complex. I mean, you could print out the cards or just
I might get a graphic designer next time rather than doing it myself. But other than that,
you could almost. I mean, I think the problem is, we're kind of imagining quite a complex future. That comment of mine around juice shop, the equivalent for scenarios, which is a huge amount of work. But if you just did the very basics and ran it 20 times, I'm sure there'd be a huge amount of feedback that would then change it going forward. So for me, this is about getting people to engage. And if you have a short duration and there's a kind of initial brief, you do your exercise and then you have a wrap up. It's the sort of thing you could easily do over 3 days with 2 hours every day, or an hour, then 2 hours, and then another hour. That's not a huge investment, but it would have a massive impact.
Also, I was just going to say, I would think most people here are generally DevOps minded. is and this is I mean, if anyone actually does this, I'm interested in talking to you, because unfortunately the conference has been postponed for a year because of the current pandemic. But I was due to give a presentation on using DevOps techniques within wargaming. So if I can use some of you as guinea pigs for my ideas, if you look at DevOps and the idea of minimum viable product, so put together something really simple, like literally draw on sheets of paper and get a few colleagues around a table for an hour, and then see where that goes, then build on there. And also, I mean, iterate, sort of the bit that's always ignored about fail fast is that's not the important thing. The important thing is to respond to the failure and improve. So you could run 20 versions of this game and the game gets better every time.
That's why I think it would be good to set up a GitHub to be able to go over each of the different aspects, because we can run through a scenario and then figure out what would work, what wouldn't, change and adjust the different part, and then do it again. And honestly, even in this process, what you'd be doing is like kind of the same thing. And I know you don't want to, you know, play it too many times to begin with, but you want to get it kind of rolling a little bit. But setting that up might make it a lot easier. And the other thing I was thinking, sorry.
No, it's fine. Carry on.
The other thing I was thinking was that Nova Labs with like PBS and Lockheed Martin put something together that had it's like a little game online. Actually choose which option to put their points behind. So it has like a limited resource type thing. It's just a simple little game, but it kind of illustrates, you know, if you block these areas, these kinds of attacks can go through. If you block these areas, these types of attacks can go through. Which ones are more harmful? Which ones are going to cause more damage? How many customers will you have or lose? And that is kind of probably something worth looking at also, and seeing, you know, we don't want to, I don't know, seeing if it would, if anything sparks any ideas for us that would be useful in what we're doing.
I mean, I'm going to be completely honest and transparent here, and the effort and time put into this outside of the actual sessions was less than 2 hours.
Yep.
And that was for the briefing sheets, that was for one architecture diagram and an idea for the platform that I threw together. And then there was about a paragraph about the company. And that was all we went into it with. So that's pretty minimum viable product, and would be easy to...
It was 2 hours that finished just before we went live as well. So
yeah,
it's what we call just-in-time gaming.
So yeah, I think minimal viable product isn't a problem. You could easily spin out a lot of different scenarios and then try them out. So you're not doing the same one every time, but you're improving the concept and working out what other bits you need, which bits you don't need, what never gets used.
Yeah, and if we can somehow, I think if we keep all of the different aspects together, like what we're thinking about changing, what we're thinking about, you know, if we keep them like organized in a nice fashion, it'd be easiest to be able to just adjust one thing or adjust another without having to go through it again and forget what we did, I guess.
So are we talking about InfoSec Games Night on a monthly basis?
I mean, I'd be down for that.
I've got a copy of EOP and the OWASP cornucopia as well.
Nice.
Yeah, I'd definitely be interested. I think it's something I haven't looked at. And I mean, I'm trying to run what is like a portfolio career, which is quite a pretentious phrase, as in doing several things at once and seeing the benefits of stringing ideas or connecting ideas between them. So I haven't put as much. I mean, like I've literally written the book, but still, there's not. As I say, part of the problem with all of this is getting buy-in on people running the exercises. So I haven't put as much emphasis on this from a career point of view as I should, but partly through this summit and partly in general, and I think it's also something to do with all the unexpected things that happen in this year, is that people are more interested in this idea now. People want to play through these kind of scenarios before they happen to them in real life. You know, if your business continuity planning didn't include no one comes into the office for 3 months, you should have played that in advance. Or if that wasn't part of your exercises, if your exercises were just, well, this office gets flooded like it does every 10 years anyway, being able to do more scenario based planning, I think finally people are seeing the value of it. People are seeing why they need it and what problems they can avoid if they go through it. So I think that's certainly worth doing, or at least starting and seeing whether there's the enthusiasm in the community beyond sort of playing a few games. But then when you have to sort of actually put things together and deal with all the criticism and play something for the 10th time, just to iron out the problems with it, that kind of thing.
So if this was written down in a way that could be reused, so we've got the materials we've done, and we wrote it down in a way that could be reused in a set of documents you could print out. You know, so whether or not you get the funky graphics, James, just have a deck of cards, and then just some of those can be the random choices, and then the review, the videos in the review session afterwards. It's the sort of thing that, with the addition of a moderator, you could try this out on people who haven't done this before. I mean, I wouldn't say that the 4 people who ran the work streams here should definitely run it again. It'd be interesting to try a different mix of people, different mix of personalities.
Yeah, I do think the moderator is something that we would have really benefited from, and that's not from IT experience, that's from gaming experience, where you do have different groups with their own ref in this case, and then a central ref who ties the whole story together.
Yeah, which is kind of driving a certain outcome. At the end of the day, it's a learning exercise. What are you trying to get out of it? I've been in these war games where someone wants to kind of be the boss and be always right, and they drive the war game to a scenario where half the people lose, and you go, well, that wasn't that great an experience. I think it's how you get that. I think the most important thing about this is actually not the taking part, it's the post review where people recognize what's actually happened.
Yeah, also, I do think that those kinds of situations could inform us of certain types of rules that would keep that kind of thing from happening, as well.
Yeah. Okay,
if that kind of thing does come up or occur, like we can introduce a different, something into the game to keep that from happening so that people aren't doing that kind of thing. It's just, it would be testing it against itself, basically.
So would the idea be to have these, the board game nights, as it were, open, closed sessions? I can see value both ways. It's much easier to be honest when it's a closed session and you might get more people, but then if it's open, there is that chance for input from outside.
You can do both, one open and then the next one closed.
Yeah, I think what'd be really interesting would be to try and persuade a company, if I don't know, Nick, if you're consulting for people, to actually run it as an exercise within a company and then take the output from that. Because I think then you're doing, what's the intent of this? It's not a group of security professionals reinforcing good behaviors. It's about dropping this into a supply chain partner, to a customer, and saying, does this actually work? Did it have the right impact? Because I think we've got some commercial drivers to this around cyber insurance or business continuity or policy governance. There's some things I think that would really be quite an easy conversation to have with an exec or a compliance officer to say, you should really do this exercise. And if we've got this as a working model, it might just try it out with 5 companies. It'd be very interesting to see what came back.
I'm almost wondering about some of the event companies who are desperately looking for things to do at the moment because they can't go and hold round table meals.
Oh man, that's an awesome market to think about.
Yeah, I did start. It was one of the last meetings I had that was a physical meeting with a war game designer I know about how to run this at conferences. With all due respect to the conference circuit, there's a lot of material presented that doesn't fit presentations. It fits blog posts or books or interactive seminars or something like this kind of interactive summit session rather than one person at the front. So I was thinking about how to run games within that kind of scenario. But of course, that's all stopped now. So it's a case of how do we do that online, which I think it's the medium's different. It's much easier to split people off and stop them talking to each other to reflect the real situation.
Yeah, asymmetry of the information.
Which is huge, and again is what something you can learn from a game much more than benefits or issues with a particular technology. Yeah. And of course, that's so much more important in dealing with an incident, is making sure the right people are informed of the right thing and only the right thing in a way that suits the timescales they're working to.
Yeah, well, we've had a lovely indication of what happens when you get misinformation recently with the DDoS attack. Definitely a DDoS attack in the States, which was nothing to do with T-Mobile outages.
Or Australia, for example. I haven't looked at that much news over the last 24 hours, so I'm hopelessly out of date on quite whether basically China launched an attack against Australia or not. But again, that looks like it's something where there's and especially the DDoS, I think, is a better example, is of that coordination amongst different sources about what's actually happening, and
definitely
also
motivation lined up, don't we?
And how to manage the net. I mean, where did I hear this? I think it was in one of the presentations earlier this week about not necessarily controlling. I think it was the NCSC presentation exercise in a box. It's not necessarily control the narrative, but you get ahead. but you get ahead of it. You talk to the media before they talk to you. You give them answers before they start asking questions. And running this kind of exercise practices you for that. So, and also, so if you don't know, you've got the confidence to say, we don't know, and this is when we will, and these are the people I'm talking to, rather than there's a DDoS against the internet. Oh, sorry, no, there isn't. Don't believe anything I said in the last 8 hours.
Yeah, what he just said.
Thank you.
I'm just thinking Gen Con might turn into the future of InfoSec conferences, which would be lovely.
Well, it's also the Wargaming conference I've been to a few times. They run a mega game on the first day, and it's a great way to introduce everyone to everyone else, because rather than you're someone who I'm trying to politely look at your lapel or equivalent to see who you are and where you work and do I know you on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever, it's actually, no, you're the one in charge of that peacekeeping unit I had that argument with over that mountain like yesterday, and now we've just watched the same presentation today, and it's immediately a way to introduce yourself to reintroduce yourself to someone. So there's all sorts of benefits to these sorts of exercises.
Okay. Well, Nick and Wallaby, I definitely want to talk to you more.
I do think that the idea of misinformation attacks in this, oh man, like, but think about this too. If you are saying in between the teams, right, kind of making sure that everything's going right, gradually on each side, you would see them making changes that you'd have to actually be able to understand and figure out what would be the vulnerabilities with each side's setup. So that would be another interesting thing to look at how to use. Anyway.
InfoSec nation state level mega game.
I mean, yeah, I guess, staying in there, it would be kind of like that, yeah.
But that's not necessarily producing so much value. That just sounds like fun.
Yeah. But I mean, at the same time,
work, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's kind of the thing. We want it to be something that's fun, but at the same time, we want it to be something that's practical. But how would we determine where the vulnerabilities are where the vulnerabilities are? How would we determine what has already been patched and what hasn't, and actually make that distinction so that when it happens, when someone makes a move, it actually automatically happens. Does that make sense? I think that's something important to look at, and not necessarily from like the nation state, kind of view, but from a practical view for the game. Like, how do we make sure that we make the connections there.
So it's either part of the preparation, or if you haven't thought of all the details, then you should be free to make up some of them.
Well, that's normally what refs end up doing. So you'll have the head ref who can make up anything they want on the fly. Everyone else will have a specific remit, and then the players can't make things up. The refs have to play off what they're given or what the players are doing. And the head ref's job is basically to keep all of the refs under control and working in the same world, because it can happen that they go off and start working in completely different directions.
And also to give the read back. I think that's the most important thing, is to read back at the end of the exercise.
Yeah, you want that report at the end of, okay, here's what actually happened. You got this tiny piece of it in your team, but this was the full narrative. This was what was going on in the background.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. It's something you can get in more, especially more, say, conventional games. You can get bogged down in the mechanics when actually the most interesting thing is what actually happened. Well, I'd sort of disagree with that without going into massive, I don't know, is it epistemological definitions of truth and so on? But if you go around a room in an after action, everybody gives their after action report of what they thought happened. The greatest lesson to everyone in the room can be how incorrect they were, how incorrect their version was. So the red team. Pardon? Yeah, I mean, well, more different to that, because that's serial, as in people passing from one to the next, but also how it can illustrate how information can be misunderstood, and then when it's passed on, it's misunderstood again, and so on. But just like, especially if the red team comes up at the end of the exercise and says, well, this is what we did, this is what we didn't do, this was where our aim, this is where you frustrated us, and this is where we changed their mind, and the blue team see how they did or didn't affect that, or how they completely misunderstood what the red team were doing, that's really illuminating to people. So as people have said, getting that feedback after an exercise is as important as the exercise itself. And it's something I would argue, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, that professional wargamers who've been running this kind of exercise to do with much more kinetic conflicts still struggle with after decades of that discipline. I mean, as with any training exercise, even it's a inherently difficult thing to do, but that's no reason we can't do it, especially in such a digital medium as well.
It is being practiced in real life now. Purple teaming is a term that not many, but it's in the genesis.
Yeah, I think the one problem I have with purple teaming, and I do think it's immensely valuable, it's the same problem I have with penetration testing and with vulnerability scanning. And it's that it happens far too late in the process to do anything really easy and effective with the results.
But its aim is to...
Its aim is fantastic. I think it just needs to happen before you've actually built and launched the system. And that's where you need the threat modeling and the more imaginary side, the security by design stuff. So I think purple teaming is invaluable. It is brilliant, but we do need to look earlier in the process as well, rather than going with everything's pen testing.
You'll have other tools for those. Purple teaming won't help you then.
No, and neither will vulnerability scanning, neither will risk management, will to a point, but none of the technological tools will actually help with that, because putting on more firewalls will help you with a pen test. To massively oversimplify it, I don't actually believe that. It's not that simple, but you can buy a technological solution to help you with findings from a pen test or a vulnerability scan, or you can do patching. But right at the beginning, when you are at the fundamental design stages, if you're not looking at these problems then, you are just making a lot more work for purple teams, red teams, blue teams further down the line. And the sort of game side of things, where you're working at that principle level, where you're not having to go into specifics of implementation, gives you a lot more flexibility on, let's do this at the design when we are first building a product, because marketing teams do it. They do sort of games where they work out who will buy this product. Some design teams do, various people do, but we're not doing it properly in security yet. And I've just realized I've gone off on a ideological rant now, so I'll take a deep breath.
Yeah, but sorry, go ahead, Wallaby, go ahead.
No, by all means.
I was going to say that's a good way to sell it. And I think, as you say, rather than, oh, I've got this crazy idea, let's basically play cyber D&D around a table. If you say, well, let's do what marketing have learned how to do, or talking to your DevOps people, you say, well, let's shift left this idea. Let's play through how this would work over a tabletop exercise. Before anyone touches a line of code, you can make massive differences and massive savings, and also be much more approachable as security practitioners than, especially say penetration testing, where you come in at the end, tell everyone involved on this thing that's taken up a lot of their time over the last few days or weeks or months or even years, how awful it is and how stupid they were, and here's the way it's broken. If you can use these kind of exercises to much earlier, you can and also, I mean, speaking as a just about penetration tester now, it's also much more rewarding to do it this way, rather than go in and say, well, basically you've wasted the last 6 months, here's your architectural failing. To go in earlier and say, here's the mistake you could have made, but now I've just saved you 12 person months of effort, is much more rewarding all round for everyone involved.
Not secure by design, but secure by scenario, yeah?
Yeah, or at least more secure by scenario,
Yeah.
or less insecure. Like the sort of, it's all, I mean, I realize it's a bit of a cliche, but it's all pushing the needle, isn't it? It's all just that little bit better.
Well, I was reading about HS2 and how they actually have, they've done a simulation on it. So they've actually done, I think Simon was talking about it, Wardley was talking about it. It's how you, a lot of this stuff, they actually mock up the whole thing in a 3D environment. So we're almost saying that if you run through the security culture you're trying to put in place, then you can build, you understand where some of the holes are anyway.
Or you can fail horribly. I think making massive dramatic mistakes in games and scenarios is
cheaper
underrated.
Than real life, for sure.
Yeah.
Wow, it's that whole, well, we feel like we've wasted an afternoon, but we haven't actually wasted an afternoon, rather than we've wasted a year on this project. And now, I mean, as James said, like marketing and so on are really smart about this kind of thing. Let's have a mock-up of the product. Let's just print out some posters for ourselves and see how this looks. Does this color scheme work? It's let's steal their ideas.
Sorry.
They steal enough of ours. They owe us.
Doing something like the secure by scenario idea, that really would be something I think would make it a lot easier to market. The one thing I was thinking about too is it would be a development tool from that angle. This, I mean, in a sense, you could make this a full process scenario tool. Like you run it at each stage just to see what it's going to be like for the specific thing that you're going to be doing, whether it's worth the cost to actually be able to do it, or whether it's not going to be something that would be usable or viable.
I mean, yeah, I guess you could zone this into a smaller group, but I think what would be really useful would be to get full participation across, wide participation, because I think the most important thing is the thing we were trying to mock up was the dynamics between customer management, blue team, red team, and I think having a broad spread of this, I think is going to be very informative. But there's no reason why you couldn't, as you think, someone said earlier, that you could, by randomly assigning people, you put a dev in a lawyer's shoes. It means that everyone's got to walk a different walk and really appreciate more of that ecosystem, because it's no good being a really crack hot security team and completely invulnerable if you've got the rest of the company open to social engineering attacks.
Right, and I guess the kind of thing that I was thinking about too with it was, depending on the situation, the scenarios could be different. So like you could have a scenario that's set in that red, blue team type scenario. You could have a scenario set in, you know, the development stages. You could have a scenario set at different points, but basically you're running the same type of principles. You're running the same type of scenarios or game.
Yeah,
like it's a different scenario, but
you've got a sort of framework that you just hang the details on.
That's exactly the word I was going to use. Yes, you want to keep this as modular and flexible as possible, and let people interpret it, let people disagree with it, let people do the equivalent of forking off their own version.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just looking up how to trademark security by scenario.
Yeah,
Cure
right.
by scenario.
Yeah, as long as you got full attribution of that phrase.
There's some really good stuff in the chat. That's saved, isn't it, for this?
Yes.
That's available afterwards. Brilliant.
That's why I've been writing there.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, we thought we were going to have this wrapped up in less than an hour.
Yeah. Best sessions are these ones.
Yeah.
So what's the next step for this? I mean, is it is it worth drafting something up and then just
I mean, honestly, I was already planning to go off and just improve the templates I used for the cards and come up with something for a general scenario brief as well as a single sheet. So that's my next step.
Why don't we drop? Sorry.
I was going to say, I've seen GitHub mentioned. I'm quite happy to upload stuff to that.
Yeah, that way we can each work on the sections that kind of
we're passionate about.
Yeah, right.
Yep, sounds good to me.
Yeah.
And then maybe we should try and reconvene in, let's let the dust settle a couple of weeks and then see, once we're past this, whether it's such a good idea. But I'm sure if we put it together, then we'll be able to sleep on it.
Yeah, I mean, if we set up a session for a couple of weeks, that would be great. Not me to create GitHub. No, I can create the GitHub. I just don't know how to use it well. But yeah, I'll get a GitHub set up. Do that now, and then if we put something in the calendar for 2-3 weeks from now to come back and see how it's going, whether it's fizzled out, whether there's still enthusiasm for it, whether it still sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, that sounds really good, because this I was just gonna say, I don't want to dull enthusiasm. Game design is really difficult, especially the amount you have to take out, especially the effort you put in and then you realize it's not needed. And as shown with this, with all due respect to James, you did it right. It sounds a bit like that might have been a bit by chance, but you don't put too much effort in because players won't use it, players don't need it, and it's the interaction between groups that generates so much content and value. You only need to give them I don't know if it's a good analogy, but like the sandbox, the playground to play in.
So that wasn't entirely by chance, to be fair, because I've been playing and running LARPs for about 20-something years.
So
So I went with the whole Nordic approach of, look, here's your seeds, go play, and we'll deal with whatever you come up with, because that's less effort.
And I think that's a good way of developing it as well. But in this kind of sense, whatever we develop can be boiled down to something that's going to be simpler. Whatever we put into it can be taken and used in a more simple way, in a less rigid way, perhaps than what we would initially think, and be still maintain the kind of the functionality and the usefulness. But whatever we put into it is only going to test how we're doing it. It's only going to change and adjust things to make sure that certain areas are going to work well with other areas, and what, it's that kind of thing. It's more, the rest of it is just testing outside of that skeleton.
Yep.
Testing how we want to do it, what the use cases are, what what people are going to be doing with it, that kind of thing.
Is it worth sticking a license on the GitHub? It's just asking me the question now. So,
Creative Commons.
which one?
Oh yeah.
Oh no, we've got Creative Commons 0. I'm assuming that is take it and do what you want with it, and I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
And let's pick a date as well.
I think the only thing I think would be worth saying would be, let's get attribution to the Open Security Summit, because they've put this together. So let's get a Creative Commons license that says you got to attribute this to Open Security Summit.
That's a good idea. Just from a general publicity.
Yeah.
Just if you use it,
I think it's CC4 or something is the one where you're allowed to use it, and then you attribute it to.
Okay.
I assume the license can be changed before anything happens.
The license is just a file in the repo.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
So I'll take that one out later. Here we go. There we go.
Brilliant.
We've got a README and a license, and I'll take the license out because currently we've got CC0. But if someone knows more about Creative Commons and wants to get one with attribution to the Open Security Summit, then we can just get that uploaded.
Right, I think driving more traffic to OSS would be good.
So let's think of a date to meet back.
Probably not a Friday.
Friday.
But
Monday, the 6th of
two and a half
July.
Monday
evenings are usually dead, but I don't know how you feel.
I don't
Tuesday
like
would be better for me. Tuesday the 7th. Why don't you just let's suggest a time, Didar, and then we can all respond.
6th of July, 6 p.m. UK time.
Whack it in.
6, 7, 6.
Just whack it in and see what people say.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'll make a 2-hour Zoom thingy. Or it can even be Google Meet because it's free on our G Suite.
Yeah, well, let's make it. Should we make it for an hour just to keep everyone focused, and do it an hour of Google Meet? That'd be great.
Alrighty.
Okay.
I'll send it to people here.
Excellent.
So between now and then, what are the main goals?
Just read back everything we've written back into this repo, so that put the links to all the videos so that anyone coming along can look at it, and then let's have a roadmap list of what we think the next stage is. And I think the conclusion we had was, if we took this and did a bit more work on some of the cards, and we matched this in so it's a usable exercise to try and find some targets that aren't drawn necessarily from the security community, maybe within a company, and see if this sits alongside something like a business continuity exercise.
I think the first goal might be figuring out the goals, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, and that kind of, yeah.
Because like I say, I would sorry to interrupt. I was just thinking, just be so conscious that wargaming or gaming or scenario planning or whatever this is such a generic tool. So be careful about either restricting the future possibilities or restricting who might be interested, because it doesn't quite do what they do. As James said, framework is such a key word, I think.
I was going to say, after the last session, I was actually having conversations with people in close and exec protection about this, and they were saying it sounds like something they should really or could really benefit from as well.
Right, and yeah, I'll talk about that with you separately.
Okay.
That's sorry to sort of just stumble on over the audio, but yeah, there's a lot of thinking around that I've been involved in already. And also, yeah, the fact that a discipline like that doesn't say, well, we do this sort of 5 times a day, every day, but it's like, that sounds like an interesting idea. We could probably use that. Shows how poorly gaming is used, and this kind of idea is used.
Yeah, because there's a lot of gamification, but it doesn't really make use of gaming. It just slaps game mechanics onto other things most of the time.
Here's an interesting thing. What if the games were actually ongoing, but the turns were shorter, if that makes sense? So basically, as they have a chance, they can do it all at once, or they can make little adjustments and increments to what they're doing and go back and forth in that way over time, so that it's not just at once, but like, all right, I want to try out this scenario and see what the response would be over there, and just kind of, go back and forth like that as well. So like, it wouldn't be necessarily time structured per se.
So iterating within the game session almost.
How do you mean?
My feeling is that, what we've just run through, which is, an hour of prep at most, 2 hours of gameplay, and then, an hour or so of feedback. I think that's a very manageable investment. And I'd say that if you got, 20 cycles of that, you'd have a very different picture. So this could go in a number of different directions, but in the spirit of an MVP, I think you'd want to, get some customer feedback first and see where there is traction.
Makes sense.
Yeah, but I like the fact that a lot of us are kind of disagreeing over things, but not quite disagreeing, but also like, well, I think it's this, and I think like I say, it's a case of keeping everything appropriately open, so then people can mold it as they see fit. Like, something I've never seen used, but which is arguably invaluable, is the idea Wallaby was saying about sort of playing around with time and so on. If someone makes a dramatic mistake, then why not just make everything, as long as you can track where all the resources are, why not just turn the clock back half an hour? You've learned the lesson from that mistake. We won't let it ruin the exercise. Let's go back half an hour. And what would you do this time? There's massive training possibilities, but it's a case of, as has been said, minimum viable product, but also keep words like framework and modular in mind, and see where this goes.
Well, you just said it again.
Thank you. But yeah, there's lots of possibilities, as you can tell by the amount I've spoken during this. I'm really enthused and reassured to see this much interest, because I sort of was introduced by chance to wargaming like 15 or so years ago, and it seems like such a great idea, and you learn so much from it, and yet no one seems to be doing it. I really get the feeling that's changing this year. The world is so unpredictable. People are looking for more interactive and better ways to learn what the hell they should do in the world than everything being as predictable as they hoped.
I mean, I'm just going to say there is a group of people who have been doing it for a long time, and that's NHS and health services, because they've been doing full patient crisis scenarios, both in getting people to come in and enact symptoms that doctors to help them with diagnosis, but also full disaster scenarios, giving people makeup, saying there's been a crisis.
That's another great example to quote at people as to why you should do this. Well, who does this? Well, the NHS handles this sort of situation and that sort of situation because they're ready for it. And of course, without wanting to get into political discussions, the current government response and how that compares to previous exercises such as Operation Cygnus. There's if I remember the name rightly, there's a lot of lessons to learn from those exercises and what or wasn't taken from them and why. I think NHS is a great example. Pardon?
If we had a government that listened.
Well, or if you put it the other way, were the war gamers not persuasive enough as to the outputs of the games? There's but as I say, sort of without sort of wanting to get into it, there's a lot to take away and learn from those sort of exercises. I know I know someone who's involved in that. I know the person who wrote the book on those exercises. I proofread his book, and I think a presentation he gave on NHS exercises is online. I'll see if I can find that.
Great. All right, so July the 6th it is.
Mm.
Yeah, there we go.
Would have been better with 666, but
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, cheers.